Hey everyone! Tonight we start with a subject that is both shocking and academic. The world of medieval sex. A world that was confusing, mysterious, and sometimes unbelievably strange. It was an age of chivalry and questionable herbal remedies. A time when foreplay often started with asking politely and hoping no one would see. But before we get started, don't forget to like and subscribe, only if you're really interested in what I do. And leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I'm always curious to see where the audience is from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for some relaxing background noise. And let's get started tonight. First, let's clear up a common misconception. Medieval sex did not take place in romantic, candle-lit bedrooms with the sound of a lute. The truth is, the most common setting was a one-room house where the entire family lived, including children, grandparents, a few goats, and maybe a chicken who kept interfering with privacy. The concept of privacy was almost non-existent. Peasant homes were often just a single room that served as part kitchen, part bedroom, part barn, distinguished mainly by smell. If a couple wanted some privacy, they had to be creative, timing it right, keeping the volume down, and ideally, waiting until the children were fast asleep facing the wall. Curtains were a luxury, and beds were often shared. Even among the nobility, servants might sleep at the end of the bed, or stand in the corner pretending not to see. Many noble families kept records of their sleeping arrangements for religious or legal reasons. And yes, that does sound strange. Travel was no better. Inns often provided shared beds. Yes, you might have to sleep next to a stranger, which made intimacy even more confusing. Want some intimacy? First, you had to check that no one was in the bed and that they had their shoes on. If you were married, both sober and, let's say, clean, you could share a straw mattress and hope for the best. If you were unmarried, you had to be doubly quiet, triple careful. Communities were small, walls were thin, and gossip spread like plague rats. In a convent, the rules were clear. No privacy, no distractions, and certainly no whispering in the middle of the night. However, human nature is not easily restrained, leading to many monasteries having to build very high fences. In the medieval world, nothing influenced individual life as much as the church. And the church had a lot to say about what went on behind the public curtain. According to the doctrine, the sole purpose of sex was procreation. That was it. Not for connection, not for emotional release, certainly not for pleasure. Anything else was a distraction or sin. This wasn't just Sunday sermons. It was the main thrust of the writings of bishops, theologians, and confessors. They wrote in great detail about what was allowed and what was not allowed to prevent out-of-the-box creativity. Certain days of the week were strictly forbidden, as were major feasts, fasts, holy days, and even liturgical seasons. Want to be intimate with your spouse during Lent? Please, no. Advent, also number, there are probably only a few Tuesdays left in April that are safe. Even in marriage, couples are advised to be reserved and restrained. Affection is fine, but not excessive. A 13th century manual suggests that couples should have sex without pleasure, without guilt, and as quickly as possible. A list of requirements that is extremely boring. The missionary position is the preferred method, not just because of its religious symbolism, but because it is seen as the most natural, with the least chance of offending God, the saints, or the priest. Confessors get involved too. They ask very specific questions during confession. to check if the couple has crossed any moral boundaries. Not vague spiritual questions, very specific, and sometimes extremely awkward. Imagine, a 14th century monk often knew his parishioners' sex lives better than their birthdays. However, the application was uneven. Some regions were very strict. Some places the priests turned a blind eye. Many people, especially peasants, just smiled, nodded, and quietly did what they wanted. If you think it's hard for modern couples to arrange a time for love, have mercy on the ancients. They needed the liturgical calendar, the approval of a priest, and the luck of saint. Valentine, who had never been married. The church didn't just have an opinion, it was a strict prohibition. Sunday, number it was the Lord's Day. Friday, number fasting day. Wednesday, questionable. Then there's Lent, 40 days, Advent, another 40 days, holy days, feast days, full moons. Finally, the love calendar is like a spiritual obstacle course. There are even lists of forbidden days. Some confessional manuals list nearly half the year as no touching. If you're hot on forbidden days, prepare for guilt and an extra confession. A 13th century bishop once scolded a couple for being too intimate. That is, more intimate than once a month. He suggested they channel their passion into prayer. The couple, unsurprisingly, were not pleased. The aristocracy was the most closely monitored. They had priests, spiritual advisors, and little room for doing anything out of line. Peasants, meanwhile, were more flexible. They were busy worrying about crops, weather, and surviving the winter. Whether Tuesday was a holy day or not was not high on their list of priorities. Doing things on the wrong day was not only considered a sin, it was also thought to lead to sick children, punishment from God, or bad publicity. If the neighbors heard that you were having too much fun during Lent, you were likely to be the subject of gossip or receive a harsh lecture and a piercing stare. Love in medieval Europe was less about romance and more about legal contracts. If you dream of candlelit dinners, love poems, and whispers, you should read the poetry of the troubadours. In reality, marriage was a business. Daughters were traded to cement alliances, buy land, or end a dispute over a pig that ate the neighbor's cabbage. The bride might bring a dowry, money, fabrics, or a small plot of land. In return, the groom's family might promise not to be too upset. Courtship, if any, took place under strict supervision. Mothers, aunts, or the whole village, everyone could watch whether you held hands. The nobility, of course. Marriages were arranged like chess. Emotions were something that could come later, or never. A proverb from that time said, "It is better to marry a rich man with an ugly face than a poor man with dimples." How romantic. Even among peasants, the criteria for choosing a spouse were very practical. Men were judged by their land, farming tools, and the size of their oxen. Women had to be responsible, maintain their reputation, and especially not cause trouble. Just because marriages were arranged as transactions doesn't mean love didn't exist. It did, but it usually came after, rarely before. If feelings developed over time, it was a bonus, not a requirement. Think of love as an emotional DLC expansion to a medieval marriage, not included in the original package. Where there's a will, there's a way, though. Sneaky courtships, romantic songs, and moonlit walks to the village well were all unchurch-approved side quests in the dating world of the time. But be careful. If you got caught kissing behind the cowshed, you could face public penance, a fine, or a very disappointed father wielding a pitchfork. The persistent myth. The chastity belt. Let's debunk one of the most famous and absurd myths about medieval relationships, the chastity belt. You may have seen these bizarre iron devices in movies, comic books, or the unfortunate souvenir counter at a museum. The story goes that they were locked around a woman's waist while her husband was away at war, ensuring that she was both physically and morally sealed. Except, that's hardly true. There's no solid historical evidence that chastity belts were widely used in the Middle Ages. Most surviving artifacts date to the Renaissance or Victorian era, periods more obsessed with medieval moral repression than historical fact. Many chastity belts were made as satire, moral warnings, or display items, not for actual use. Medieval manuscripts, which are rich in sensitive details, are silent about the mass production or use of chastity belts. No tailors advertised them, no laws regulated them, and no churches gave out chastity belts at weddings. Apparently, and bear with me, they were never a thing, and that makes sense, since their design was incredibly inconvenient. Medieval hygiene was difficult enough. Now imagine adding a rusty iron device, no instructions, a lock that required a blacksmith. Chastity belts probably caused more infections than they prevented infidelity. The church didn't like it, but the city regulated it carefully. Contrary to the rigid moral image we often have, some medieval cities operated brothels as legitimate businesses. From Germany to France, many municipalities licensed, taxed, and even zoned red light districts, centuries before the invention of the light bulb. Some even appointed officials to run them, called public women's wardens, a title that would be hard to put on a CV. The reason? Pragmatism. Authorities believed that allowing men to relieve themselves in a controlled environment would reduce the risk of more serious crimes like rape, adultery, or dancing. Of course, the church officially condemned it. But in practice, many priests turned a blind eye, even collecting rent from the brothels. If that sounds like hypocrisy, congratulations. You've understood the true nature of religious beliefs and practices of the time. Working in a brothel wasn't a fairy tale, but it wasn't all hell either. Some women chose the profession for financial reasons, especially widows or those without families to support them. Others were sold, tricked, or bought, especially in busy ports. Surprisingly, there were even manuals for running a brothel: clean beds, regular health checks, specific hours. Clients ranged from knights, apprentices, merchants, to monks, though their vows clearly didn't support it. Payment? Sometimes in cash, sometimes in eggs, wool, or some odd item the customer has on hand. This isn't medieval Tinder. It's a separate universe, full of realities and contradictions. The scent of love and the smell of a pigsty. Imagine the scene. Flickering candlelight, wind blowing through the thatched roof, your lover whispering sweet nothings, then taking off his sheepskin coat, revealing a distinctly medieval, manly scent. Personal hygiene existed, just not as much of a priority as surviving a plague, fixing the roof, or catching a pig that had just made a mess in the kitchen. Peasants bathed, rarely, maybe once a month or more if they fell in the river. Soap was expensive, often imported or homemade, and only used when absolutely necessary. Cities had public baths, but they were often closed during epidemics or scandals. The rich had a choice: hot baths infused with herbs, and a linen cloth served by servants. The poor would throw cold water and pray that no one else would smell it. Worse, water was sometimes considered dangerous. Some believed that bathing too much weakened the body. making it susceptible to disease. And even if you wanted to bathe, you had to fight for water with the village geese. Deodorant? Only for the upper classes. Deodorant? Dream on. Toothbrushing? Maybe with ash or mint leaves if you were uppity. Kissing in those days? A real adventure. Clothing? Layers of wool, leather, linen, fur. Great at keeping in the heat, and also keeping out the smells from the buffalo pen, the soup pot, and the portable toilet. And despite all that, people still loved, flirted, and were close. Maybe the standards were different, or maybe when everyone smelled the same, love was truly smellless. Family planning in the pre-planning era. Controlling the number of children in the Middle Ages was like trying to drive a wheelless, bridleless cart and being pulled astray by a ravenous goat. In short, not impossible, but close to impossible. The ancients weren't naive. They knew the connection between actions and consequences, and they tried, sometimes in bizarre ways. There were herbal remedies, condoms made from animal intestines, and magical rituals like burying charms on your doorstep. Some experts recommended drinking wine made from beaver testicles. Ancient books even recommended jumping up and down vigorously after sex. At least it burned calories. There were primitive barrier methods, medicated linen, beeswax, and primitive versions of condoms. But you don't want to know how to make them. The church, of course, strongly objected. Before the wedding bells, after, the fine. While the church may have made it seem as if every couple waited until the church bells rang to get intimate, the reality was that many people couldn't wait. Try before you buy was so common that it required official paperwork. In church records, it was called fornication. In the mouths of the villagers, it was simply going ahead of schedule. Premarital intimacy was not uncommon, but it was closely monitored. Across Europe, local officials kept morality books, essentially public shame registers. If caught or even suspected, couples could be hauled into town court and fined. The fines sometimes went to the church, sometimes to the local government, and more than once, to the person who happened to see it all. The art of medieval snitching was alive and well. Fines varied depending on criminal records, whether or not a couple was pregnant, and whether they eventually married. If they were married, they were sometimes exempted from the fine, like a license issued retroactively. If not, they were still fined, but they might be given a discount, a so-called early bird fee. But don't forget the social consequences. Gossip spread faster than a spoiled meat pie in July. Often such cases led to handfasting, an informal engagement, enough to be considered a betrothal, and in some places, enough to justify cohabitation. The church later tried to tighten this loophole, but many medieval babies were still born a few months early, quite by accident. Virginity, morality, contracts, and collective obsession. Among peasants, things were more practical. If the couple were clearly serious and already pregnant, the wedding was often rushed, sometimes in the form of a runaway wedding, gently or forcefully, pushed by both families. But in the aristocracy, things got much more serious. Virginity was not just a virtue, it was a contract clause, a political tool, and a public obsession. A broken engagement could spark a bloody feud. An illegitimate child could destroy a generation of family strategy. And how did they verify it? The answer is, very badly. Sometimes it was just a character assessment. She seemed decent, or at least kept her distance from the groom. Other times it was a professional test. with midwives, or matrons, examining the hymen, which modern science has proven is not a good measure of virginity. But that didn't stop anyone. In some regions, bloody sheets were expected after the wedding night as a highly inconvenient version of a post-product review. If the sheets were clean, the consequences could be lawsuits, annulments, and a courtly drama that would last for years. And the men? They were not subject to any inspection. Male virginity was considered an optional accessory. No one checked the groom's sheets the next morning. At most, he was advised to stay away from taverns and loose women. In religious terms, virgins were seen as vessels of purity. A poetic read, a horrifying experience. Girls were taught to idolize female martyrs, stories that were more terrifying than inspiring. An annulment because of a dishonest bride could not only ruin her reputation, but also cost her entire family property and social standing. In short, in medieval Europe, virginity was legal currency. Homosexuality existed, but hidden. If you're wondering whether homosexuality existed in the Middle Ages, the answer is yes. Human inclinations didn't suddenly appear in the 20th century. But if you're asking whether they were openly accepted, the story gets complicated. Medieval society revolved around the church, social roles, and property rights, all three of which discouraged who loves whom in ways that deviated from the heterosexual norm. Officially, homosexuality was considered a sin, lumped in with unnatural acts like dancing on a major holiday or reading too much. But punishments varied widely by region, period, and class. Peasants might be warned or lightly punished, while nobles, if they had a lot of land, they could get away with it. However, the reality was more complicated than the sermons. We have love letters, poetry, and legal records that show deep emotional relationships between people of the same sex. Monks wrote to each other in Latin in a tone that was anything but fraternal. Noblewomen slept together, pledged allegiance, and wrote passionate lines that would have made a troubadour blush. Monasteries and single-sex communities unintentionally created deep emotional bonds. Many historians debate whether these relationships were romantic, platonic, or something in between. But either way, the feelings were real, and the poetry was there. There was no such thing as gender identity as there is today. No one came out, just quiet, careful living, speaking in metaphors. There was no pride, but there were songs, stories, and pilgrimages that were very romantic. Adultery. As dangerous as juggling a knife with a live chicken, adultery in the Middle Ages was like trying to hold a live chicken while juggling knives. Dangerous, noisy, and likely to cost someone both reputation and fortune. Let's be clear. Adultery was not just a personal wrong. It was a social transgression. Marriage was a sacred sacrament, as well as a legal contract, a property agreement, and a political strategy. Breaking it was a systemic offense. For women, the stakes were much higher. A wife caught in adultery could be shamed, lose her dowry, publicly repent, or exiled, especially if there was evidence. A noblewoman caught in the act could be locked up, divorced, or discreetly disappeared from royal life. Not the scarlet letter, the scarlet exit. Men? Adultery with an unmarried woman was generally considered indecent, but rarely punished, unless the girl's family was powerful or the church was particularly strict that day. Not everyone got away with it, though. Some towns imposed heavy fines or forced public confessions. There were creative punishments, being paraded around the village in just a nightgown, or tsiki, having to pay. Homosexuality existed, but hidden. If you're wondering whether homosexuality existed in the Middle Ages, the answer is yes. Human inclinations didn't suddenly appear in the 20th century. But if you're asking whether they were openly accepted, the story gets complicated. Medieval society revolved around the church, social roles, and property rights, all three of which discouraged who loves whom in ways that deviated from the heterosexual norm. Officially, homosexuality was considered a sin, lumped in with unnatural acts like dancing on a major holiday or reading too much. But punishments varied widely by region, period, and class. Peasants might be warned or lightly punished, while nobles, if they had a lot of land, they could get away with it. However, the reality was more complicated than the sermons. We have love letters, poetry, and legal records that show deep emotional relationships between people of the same sex. Monks wrote to each other in Latin in a tone that was anything but fraternal. Noble women slept together, pledged allegiance, and wrote passionate lines that would have made a troubadour blush. Monasteries and single-sex communities unintentionally created deep emotional bonds. Many historians debate whether these relationships were romantic, platonic, or something in between. But either way, the feelings were real, and the poetry was there. There was no such thing as gender identity as there is today. No one came out, just quiet, careful living, speaking in metaphors. There was no pride, but there were songs, stories, and pilgrimages that were very romantic. Adultery. As dangerous as juggling a knife with a live chicken, adultery in the Middle Ages was like trying to hold a live chicken while juggling knives. Dangerous, noisy, and likely to cost someone both reputation and fortune. Let's be clear. Adultery was not just a personal wrong. It was a social transgression. Marriage was a sacred sacrament, as well as a legal contract, a property agreement, and a political strategy. Breaking it was a systemic offense. For women, the stakes were much higher. A wife caught in adultery could be shamed, lose her dowry, publicly repent, or exiled, especially if there was evidence. A noblewoman caught in the act could be locked up, divorced, or discreetly disappeared from royal life. Not the scarlet letter, the scarlet exit. Men? Adultery with an unmarried woman was generally considered indecent, but rarely punished, unless the girl's family was powerful or the church was particularly strict that day. Not everyone got away with it, though. Some towns imposed heavy fines or forced public confessions. There were creative punishments, being paraded around the village in just a nightgown, or tsiki, having to pay. Consent, contracts, and complicated vows. In medieval Europe, consent in marriage technically mattered. In fact, according to canon law, a marriage was valid if both parties simply said, "I will," to each other, even if they were standing in a cow field without a priest in sight. Romantic? Maybe. Legally ambiguous? Definitely. But here's the twist. While consent was recognized in theory, in practice, especially for women, it was more of a formality than a choice. Noble daughters often gave consent after the deal had been sealed between fathers like generals negotiating a ceasefire. Her opinion might have been requested, but everyone knew the dowry spoke louder. Peasant women had slightly more freedom, but it came with conditions. Saying no to a suitor could mean isolation, hardship, or worse, angering the local Reeves' son, never a good idea. And once inside marriage, things got even murkier. A wife was expected to pay the marital debt, which sounds like a shared bank loan but was far less consensual. Still, medieval justice wasn't completely asleep at the moral wheel. Courts sometimes did take cases of coercion or assault seriously, especially if the accused lacked influence. Urban records from places like London or Paris show both women and men stepping forward with complaints. Sometimes justice was served. Other times, at least a bit of public embarrassment was handed out. And literature? That's where the emotional tangle came alive. In courtly love poetry, knights sighed, ladies refused, and everyone performed emotional acrobatics worthy of a medieval soap opera. Consent was implied, debated, and usually ignored, but at least they knew to ask first, which is more than can be said for some. Pleasure? Proceed with suspicion. If you've ever had the sense that the medieval church was deeply suspicious of people enjoying themselves, congratulations. You've picked up on 1,000 years of theological side-eye. The official stance on intimacy. Acceptable barely, and only if you were actively trying to populate the next generation of serfs. Sex within marriage wasn't banned, logistical nightmare, but it was highly regulated. Think of it as the church's version of an emotional zoning ordinance, allowed once a month, in the dark, with minimal enthusiasm. Smiling was not encouraged. The church held up celibacy as the spiritual gold standard. Saints were celibate. Monks and nuns took vows. Even married couples were urged to abstain as a mark of holiness or exhaustion. If you and your spouse agreed to give up sex entirely, that wasn't seen as a lack of intimacy. It was halfway to sainthood. Theologians like St. Jerome doubled down. For him, even wanting your spouse was a spiritual weakness. Sex was for babies, not bonding, not pleasure, and definitely not because your partner looked good in their woolen nightshirt. Priests were trained to ask married couples if they'd been too lustful, even with each other. Imagine confessing that to a man who had taken a vow never to marry or have sex. Uncomfortable? You bet. But despite the sermons, people lived their lives. Most nodded respectfully in church, then went home to share real affection, chores, and possibly a bottle of dubious ale. For some devout couples, celibacy was a goal. For most others, it was a suggestion, filed politely next to "Don't eat meat on Fridays" and "Try not to stab your neighbor." Yes, they fell in love. With all these rules, punishments, and herbal birth control methods that may or may not have involved beaver testicles, you might wonder, did anyone in the Middle Ages actually fall in love? Absolutely. Awkwardly, passionately, and, occasionally, happily. Love bloomed in fields, markets, and mead halls. Peasant couples flirted while hauling turnips. Nobles whispered poetry at banquets while pretending to care about falconry. Monks and nuns wrote letters dripping with emotional intensity, leaving modern scholars debating whether it was holy devotion or a slow-burn romantic novella. Courtly love stories romanticized longing, especially when it involved someone married to someone else, preferably your boss. Sure, it was emotionally impractical, but it made for excellent song lyrics. Some people even married for love. Records survive of peasants who refused arranged marriages, or even eloped. Noble rebels also existed, though their actions sent accountants and dowry managers into full-blown panic. And even the church, surprisingly, required verbal consent from both bride and groom, even if it was mumbled through gritted teeth while holding a goose as symbolic payment. And once the marriage was sealed, many couples formed strong partnerships. They worked together, raised children, endured plagues, and navigated medieval bureaucracy, a true bonding experience. Letters between spouses during times of separation reveal genuine longing, warmth, and wit. Some widows and widowers even remarried for companionship, not convenience. Because beneath all the rituals, rules, and risk, people still wanted to love and be loved, preferably before curfew, and ideally not during Lent. Zeno and the painted porch of resilient centuries before all this medieval messiness, another man faced disaster, and instead of despair, he found philosophy. Zeno of Citium was a wealthy merchant with ships, dyes, and a Mediterranean empire in the making. But one storm near Athens changed everything. His fleet was lost, his fortune gone. Suddenly he was not a merchant, but a man wrecked, wet, broke, and standing at the edge of reinvention. Wandering through the Athenian agora, Zeno found a humble bookshop. There he picked up a copy of Xenophon's Memorabilia, a tribute to Socratic wisdom. He asked where he might find a living Socrates. The bookseller, in true philosophical fashion, pointed to a cranky man in the distance. Crates the cynic, who had once thrown away his wealth just to prove a point. Zeno became Crates' student. It wasn't easy. Crates lived in theatrical poverty, and Zeno wasn't quite ready to swap silk for sackcloth, but ideas took root. Zeno started borrowing Socratic ethics, cynic discipline, and logic from thinkers like Heraclitus. Slowly, his own philosophy emerged. He began teaching in the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch of Athens, from which Stoicism gets its name. Not a palace, not a private academy, but a public space, open to all. Fitting, because Stoicism was forged not in comfort, but in collapse. Zeno's message: the world may be chaotic, but it is not random. Beneath the mess is logos, the rational order of the universe. We may not always understand it, but it exists. The Stoic path wasn't about avoiding hardship. It was about enduring it, understanding it, and when possible, growing from it. Zeno didn't just survive his shipwreck. He transformed it into philosophy. And in doing so, he offered a framework for how to live. Not when things are easy, but when they aren't.
Alone, but with discipline and steel. His name? Cleanthes, a former boxer who brought muscle to the mind. Cleanthes wasn't your typical philosopher. Before he ever scribbled a single scroll or stood beneath the painted porch, he was a boxer. Not metaphorically, a literal pugilist, earning his bread through sheer physical strength and relentless endurance. But when he discovered Zeno's teachings, he found a different kind of strength. The kind that didn't bruise but braced the soul. He worked by night carrying water for a gardener and studied philosophy by day. His hands were calloused, his muscles worn, but his mind unshakable. Cleanthes embodied the Stoic belief that virtue comes not from privilege but from perseverance. He didn't speak of theories he hadn't tested. If Zeno taught that one should accept hardship with grace, Cleanthes lived it every sunrise. His most famous work, the Hymn to Zeus, is a poetic tribute to Logos, the divine rationality that governs all things. But don't let the title fool you. This wasn't religious flattery. It was a calm declaration of cosmic order. Everything, Cleanthes wrote, is woven into a grand plan, even the painful parts. His Stoicism was like a glacier, silent, immense, and impossible to move. He also introduced a more emotional texture to Stoicism. While Zeno emphasized logic and detachment, Cleanthes suggested that proper emotions, like awe at nature or love for wisdom, could have a place if they aligned with reason. He wasn't arguing for indulgence, just for balance. After all, what good is a philosophy that turns you into a robot? Cleanthes wasn't flashy, and he didn't gather crowds with clever wordplay. In fact, some mocked him for being slow of speech. But what he lacked in eloquence, he made up for in steadiness. And in Stoicism, steadiness was everything. He eventually succeeded Zeno as head of the Stoic school, not because he was charismatic, but because he lived the philosophy more fully than anyone else. His life was a kind of walking proof, a quiet testament that one could endure hardship without bitterness, question fate without rage, and remain grounded without giving up on greatness. Through Cleanthes, Stoicism gained muscle. Not the kind that wins applause, but the kind that holds your spine straight when the world goes sideways. And then came a man who sharpened Stoicism like a blade, Chrysippus, the logician who turned this porch-born philosophy into a towering system of thought. If Zeno founded Stoicism and Cleanthes gave it strength, Chrysippus gave it its skeleton. Without him, Stoicism might have crumbled into vague ideas and forgotten porch lectures. Instead, it became one of the most rigorous philosophical systems in the ancient world, thanks to a man who reportedly wrote over 700 books. Most of them now lost, but their influence? Undeniable. Chrysippus was relentless. He didn't just inherit the school from Cleanthes, he rebuilt it. Where Zeno had been reserved and Cleanthes poetic, Chrysippus was surgical. His specialty: logic. In a time when most philosophers leaned on rhetoric or emotional appeal, Chrysippus built a system of reasoning that could rival Aristotle's. He was obsessed with clarity. He believed that if Stoicism was to survive, it couldn't rely on charisma or tradition. It had to make sense. Ironclad. No loopholes. No fluff. He refined the Stoic distinction between what is in our control and what is not. He expanded their ethics, metaphysics, and physics into something coherent and unapologetically difficult. Chrysippus argued that virtue alone was sufficient for happiness, not virtue plus comfort or virtue plus friends. Just virtue, full stop. One of his most famous contributions was the lecton, a concept describing the meaning behind words. He argued that every spoken word had a sayable, a layer of content carried by speech, tied to logic. It might sound abstract, but this deepened the Stoic understanding of reason and clarity, which for them was essential to a good life. But he wasn't just dry parchment and dusty scrolls. Chrysippus had a biting wit. Once, when accused of not practicing what he preached, he supposedly replied, "Would you blame a doctor who gets sick? He still knows how to treat illness." Stoicism wasn't about pretending to be perfect. It was about trying, every single day, to close the gap between your actions and your ideals. Thanks to Chrysippus, Stoicism hardened. It became more than a comfort for shipwrecked merchants or poetic boxers. It became a discipline, something you studied, practiced, and used to cut through confusion and chaos. And that discipline would soon find its way out of Greece, into the heart of Rome, where emperors and slaves alike would grapple with its power. By the time Stoicism drifted into Rome, the philosophy had already weathered centuries of refinement. But in the hands of the Romans, it evolved from a Greek intellectual pursuit into a way of life suited for statesmen, generals, and even emperors. The Romans weren't interested in abstract metaphysics or syllogisms about lector. They wanted practicality. They faced wars, conspiracies, betrayal, and personal ruin, and they needed a system that could hold their inner world steady, while the outer world collapsed. Stoicism, with its focus on self-mastery and virtue in the face of chaos, was a perfect fit. Enter Seneca the Younger, philosopher, playwright, and reluctant advisor to the notoriously unstable Emperor Nero. Seneca wasn't born into hardship. He was a wealthy elite, well-educated, and dangerously close to power. But despite his position, his writings reveal a man deeply aware of life's fragility and the corrupting lure of comfort. In his letters to Lucilius, Seneca preached restraint, mindfulness, and simplicity. He warned against being ruled by emotion or desire, and yet his own life was a battlefield between Stoic ideals and political compromise. He amassed wealth even as he wrote about frugality. He served a tyrant even while writing about virtue. But rather than discredit him, this tension makes him more relatable. Seneca didn't pose as a saint. He was painfully aware of his contradictions. His advice to others often came with a quiet self-rebuke. "I am not a wise man," he wrote, "but a lover of wisdom." And maybe that's the most Stoic thing of all, not to claim mastery, but to pursue it humbly. While Seneca offered Stoicism to the elite, another Roman gave it to everyone else. Epictetus, a former slave. Crippled and impoverished, Epictetus owned nothing, not even himself, and yet he taught that true freedom comes from within. "You may chain my leg," he said, "but not even Zeus can conquer my mind." To him, life's hardships weren't obstacles. They were training grounds for virtue. His teachings, preserved by his student Arrian, became a Stoic manual for inner liberation. In Rome, Stoicism was no longer just philosophy. It was armour, mental armour. And soon, that armour would be worn by the man who ruled the known world, Marcus Aurelius, emperor, warrior, and the most unlikely of all, a philosopher king. It's one thing to read philosophy in peace. It's another to write it on the front lines of war, while ruling an empire crumbling at its edges. Marcus Aurelius, crowned emperor of Rome in 161 CE, was a man born into unimaginable privilege. And yet, his reign was anything but comfortable. Plagues swept across the empire. Germanic tribes pushed at the borders. His co-emperor Lucius Verus died early. His generals betrayed him. And worst of all, his own son, Commodus, would grow into the tyrant he had hoped never to raise. Amid all this, Marcus didn't write speeches or propaganda. He wrote to himself, quiet, personal reflections later compiled into the Meditations. Never intended for publication, these pages offer a window into a Stoic mind under siege. They read not like declarations from a throne, but like whispered reminders from a tired man trying to stay upright. "Begin each day by telling yourself," he wrote, "Today I shall meet with interference, ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness." That wasn't pessimism. It was preparation. Marcus believed that by expecting hardship, he could face it without being thrown off course. To him, people's actions were not insults. They were reflections of their ignorance. And his duty wasn't to control others, but to control himself. He often reminded himself, "You could die tomorrow. You could die today. So act now, not with anxiety, but with purpose." That wasn't despair. That was clarity. Despite commanding legions and managing a vast empire, Marcus was obsessed with inner life. He believed you could be surrounded by chaos and still remain untouched if your mind stayed anchored in reason and virtue. He rarely indulged in cruelty. He rejected opulence, and while he couldn't always live up to Stoic ideals, who could? He returned to them like a compass in a storm. Marcus Aurelius didn't invent Stoicism, but in many ways he lived it more visibly than anyone before him. He proved that Stoicism wasn't just for philosophers in togas or ascetic monks. It was for anyone, even the most powerful man on earth, who wanted to carry peace into the battlefield of life. And yet, after Marcus, the flame of Stoicism began to flicker. It wouldn't vanish, but it would retreat, waiting centuries to be rediscovered by new seekers of calm in the modern world. After the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE, Stoicism didn't exactly die, but it faded. The philosophy that had once stood at the heart of Roman intellectual life began to slip quietly into the background. Part of this had to do with politics. Marcus's son, Commodus, inherited the empire and seemed determined to undo every Stoic virtue his father lived by. While Marcus embodied restraint and wisdom, Commodus embodied indulgence and vanity. The Roman court became a theatre of excess, and philosophy had no role in the spectacle. Meanwhile, a new force was rising: Christianity. As it spread through the Roman Empire and eventually became state religion, its theology, rituals, and worldview began to replace the ancient schools. Where Stoicism taught self-reliance, Christianity emphasized divine grace. Where Stoicism taught acceptance of fate, Christianity spoke of redemption and the will of God. Though these ideas weren't always in conflict, Christian thinkers often saw Stoicism as a noble but ultimately pagan system, admirable yet incomplete. And yet, Stoicism didn't vanish. It simply migrated, its core ideas seeping into early Christian thought. Many church fathers admired the Stoics. Thinkers like Augustine, though critical of Stoic pride, respected their moral seriousness. And monastic traditions, especially among Christian ascetics, borrowed heavily from Stoic discipline. Silence, simplicity, denial of luxury, and the examination of conscience, all of these would have felt right at home in the writings of Epictetus or Seneca. Throughout the medieval period, Stoicism became a sort of background philosophy, respected by scholars, cited by monks, but rarely practiced in full. It was no longer a public movement or a street-side school. It was a whisper in the margins, kept alive by scribes, theologians, and the occasional curious mind. But survival is sometimes stronger than success. Stoicism's quiet endurance meant that when the intellectual winds shifted centuries later, during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, its ideas would be ready to return. For all its decline, Stoicism had left seeds buried in the soil of Western thought. And when people once again sought clarity, purpose, and strength without illusion, those seeds would bloom. And one day, they'd even show up in places no ancient philosopher could have imagined, in self-help books, leadership seminars, and yes, on your favourite podcast. Stoicism's comeback didn't arrive with a scroll in hand. It came through blogs, books, and podcasts. After centuries of quiet influence, the ancient philosophy found itself suddenly reborn in the digital age, repackaged for a world buzzing with distractions, anxieties, and the pressure to constantly optimize everything. In the 20th century, philosophers like Pierre Hadot began peeling back the layers of Stoicism, reminding readers that it wasn't just an intellectual exercise, it was a way of life. Not cold, but contemplative. Not harsh, but healing. Hadot argued that ancient philosophy was originally a spiritual practice, and Stoicism, more than any other school, was meant to be lived, not merely read. That message hit home for a new generation. In the early 2000s, authors like Ryan Holiday helped usher Stoicism into the mainstream with accessible books like The Obstacle is the Way and Ego is the Enemy. Drawing on Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus, Holiday framed Stoicism as a practical toolkit for resilience, something you could use whether you were launching a startup, coaching a sports team, or just trying to survive a bad Monday. Tech leaders and entrepreneurs soon latched on. Tim Ferriss, Naval Ravikant, and others began citing Stoic texts like instruction manuals for high-performance living. The idea was simple. In a world that moves fast, thinks shallow, and craves constant validation, Stoicism offers an antidote: stillness, control, and clarity. Even mental health professionals took notice. Therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, borrow heavily from Stoic principles. Challenge your thoughts. Focus on what you can control. Don't let emotion dictate action. Sound familiar? But the revival wasn't without criticism. Some said modern Stoicism had been stripped of its depth, turned into motivational wallpaper for productivity bros. And there's truth to that. Not every inspirational quote on Instagram reflects the rigour or humility of ancient practice. Still, the fact remains. Stoicism survived not because it was trendy, but because it works. When life goes sideways, when we lose a job, face a diagnosis, or wake up unsure of our place in the world, Stoicism reminds us, you can't control what happens, but you can control what you become. That message has never been more timely, and so we arrive at the present, where ancient wisdom quietly guides modern minds. Today, Stoicism exists in a paradox. It is an ancient philosophy designed for inner peace, now living in a world obsessed with noise. Scroll through social media and you'll see a quote from Marcus Aurelius, sandwiched between cat videos and stock tips. Open a bestseller list, and there it is again. The Daily Stoic, waiting to be your morning mental vitamin. Somehow, a 2,300-year-old porch philosophy is trending. But Stoicism isn't popular because it's fashionable. It's popular because it addresses a very specific modern hunger, mental clarity in a world of confusion. When everything feels out of control, the economy, relationships, climate, algorithms, Stoicism offers a map inward. It teaches us to focus, not on the chaos around us, but on the choices we still own. The central questions remain the same. What is in your control? What kind of person will you choose to be, regardless of circumstance? And unlike some philosophies that demand total withdrawal from the world, Stoicism invites us to participate. Go to work, raise your kids, serve your community, but do it from a place of calm, not craving. Action, yes, but grounded action. In that sense, Stoicism is a kind of rebellion, not the loud, sign-waving kind, but a silent resistance against impulsiveness, distraction, and emotional chaos. It's the discipline to pause before reacting, the courage to stay kind in a cruel moment, the humility to know you're not the center of the universe, but you are responsible for how you move through it. More than ever, people are returning to this simple clarity. Athletes use it to manage pressure. Veterans use it to process trauma. CEOs use it to lead without ego. Teenagers, overwhelmed by the constant flood of comparison and digital noise, turn to Epictetus for a lifeline. Of course, no philosophy is a magic cure. You'll still feel grief, still fail, still lose your temper. But Stoicism gives you something rare, a framework to get back up, reflect, and recenter. In the end, it's not about being perfect, it's about progress. Quiet, steady, internal progress. And in a world that rewards loudness, maybe the most revolutionary act is to be still. To a modern visitor, an ancient Roman bath might look like a luxury resort. Marble floors, vaulted ceilings, statues of gods, and pools steaming in the morning sun. But to a Roman, it was just another Tuesday. Bathing wasn't an occasional treat. It was a daily ritual, and for many, an essential part of being Roman. By the height of the empire, there were over 900 public baths in Rome alone, ranging from grand imperial complexes to modest neighbourhood facilities. Everyone from senators to shoemakers made time to bathe. Cleanliness was important, yes, but so was the rhythm of the experience, the routine, the conversation, the heat. The process was deliberate. You'd enter through the apoditerium, or changing room, where slaves might help wealthier patrons undress. From there, you'd ease into the tepidarium, a warm room that opened your pores and began the relaxation. Then came the caldarium, the heart of the experience, a hot, steamy chamber heated by an underfloor system called the hypocaust. Here, bathers would sweat, scrape their skin with strigils, curved metal tools, and sometimes even get a massage. Finally, you'd plunge into the frigidarium, a cold pool meant to tighten the skin and jolt the senses. It was this contrast, hot to cold, sweat to chill, that gave the ritual its power. Romans believed it was good for circulation, digestion, and even mood, and honestly, they were probably right. But more than hygiene or health, baths were about belonging. You went to see and be seen. You gossiped, networked, debated politics, made business deals, or just eavesdropped on the latest scandal. Some brought their own musicians. Others brought snacks. Poets recited verses. Philosophers argued under domed ceilings, echoing with laughter and steam. In essence, a Roman bath was a democratic space, at least by Roman standards. Status mattered, but even emperors might share a room with commoners. Slaves and women had restricted access or separate hours, but they too were part of this daily world. For the Romans, bathing wasn't about vanity. It was about routine, health, society, and rhythm. A place where the individual dissolved, just a bit, into the larger hum of the empire. One breath of steam at a time. Roman baths weren't just impressive. They were engineering masterpieces. Long before the modern sauna or heated flooring, the Romans figured out how to transform bricks, fire, and water into an immersive wellness centre. At the core of this innovation was the hippocaust system, an early form of central heating. Beneath the floors of the hot rooms, slaves stoked a roaring furnace, or prefernium. This fire heated a space beneath the raised floor, supported by small columns called pillae. Hot air flowed through this subfloor chamber and up through flues in the walls, radiating heat through the room like a gentle oven. The result? A consistent, enveloping warmth without smoke suffocating the bathers. The architecture itself was strategic. Vaulted ceilings trapped heat, domes diffused sound, and a complex arrangement of rooms regulated temperature flow, from the cooler apoditerium to the temperate tepidarium to the blazing caldarium. Windows were designed to harness sunlight, and water was constantly circulating, clean, flowing, and heated to exacting standards. And let's talk about the aqueducts, the silent heroes of the empire. These elevated stone channels delivered vast quantities of water into the cities, allowing even inland bath complexes to operate year-round. Some of the grandest baths, like those of Caracalla or Diocletian, consumed millions of litres of water daily. Yet the system was so well built that waste was minimal and flow was constant. The water wasn't just used for soaking. Romans also had steam rooms, saunas, and even primitive flushing toilets nearby. Sewage was carried away through underground drainage systems. Again, all gravity-powered. The baths weren't isolated marvels. They were integrated into the broader infrastructure of Roman urban life. Maintenance was constant. Workers known as fornicatores tended the furnaces, while others cleaned the pools, managed supplies of wood, or repaired tiles and plumbing. It was labour-intensive, but the reward was clear. These buildings didn't just last years, many stood strong for centuries. In an age with no electricity, no industrial machinery, and no digital thermostats, the Romans created a seamless experience of heat, comfort, and flow. That's why walking into a Roman bath wasn't just entering a building, it was entering a system, one powered by fire, sustained by water, and shaped by genius. Despite all the sweat, steam, and strigils, Roman baths were never just about physical cleansing. They were about information. In a society without smartphones, email, or newspapers, the baths functioned as a kind of open-air broadcast centre. Gossip didn't trickle here. It flowed. Senators, merchants, soldiers, and poets all mingled freely, with togas off and voices raised. Conversations carried across the tepidarium like wildfire. Who was sleeping with whom? What was the emperor plotting? Which general just lost a battle in the east? Who bribed which magistrate to get out of paying taxes? If you wanted to know what was happening in Rome, or what might happen soon, the bathhouse was the place to listen. This wasn't accidental. The Roman elite knew the baths were public arenas, and they used them strategically. Politics didn't stop at the Senate steps. They soaked right into the marble floors of the caldarium. A clever patrician might accidentally bump into a rival in the hot room and float a proposal under the haze of steam. Or perhaps a patron would meet a client to reaffirm loyalties, offer advice, or drop a veiled threat, all while lounging in the pool. Even emperors played the game. It's said that Hadrian and later Antoninus Pius made a point of visiting the public baths as an act of image control, appearing accessible, wise, and invested in the lives of ordinary citizens. Of course, they had private bath wings too, but showing up in the public zone was a statement. I'm still one of you, sort of. It wasn't just politics that steamed up the tiles. Businessmen negotiated deals, poets recited lines, philosophers debated ethics. The acoustics of the domed rooms often helped amplify voices, a useful trick for anyone who wanted their cleverness overheard. In a strange way, the bathhouse was Rome's version of Twitter, Wall Street, and the Senate floor, all at once. It was unfiltered, buzzing, and deeply performative, but it was also where strategy was born. Real decisions, military, financial, personal, often started here, far from the formal halls of power. Because when everyone is half naked, sweating and relaxed, masks fall away. And in the steam, the real empire whispered its plans. To the Romans, bathing wasn't just about feeling fresh or looking polished. It was a critical part of health and medicine. The bathhouse was where ancient wellness philosophy met practical self-care. Doctors recommended it, philosophers endorsed it, even the military encouraged it. Hot water, cold plunges, sweating and massages were all believed to purify the body and balance the humours. The four fluids the Romans thought governed health: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If these got out of balance, you got sick. But a visit to the baths, with its cycle of heating, scraping and cooling, could supposedly restore that balance. And there's some logic to it, even by modern standards. The heat of the caldarium opened pores, relaxed muscles, and helped with circulation. The cold plunge in the frigidarium reduced inflammation and invigorated the senses. The skin was scraped clean with strigils, which removed dirt, oil, and dead skin. Afterward, many Romans received massages using scented oils, sometimes infused with herbs, sometimes just olive oil. Today, we might call this detoxing or hydrotherapy. They just called it daily life. Some of the larger bath complexes even included small medical clinics where physicians, often Greek-educated, examined patients, offered treatments, or suggested dietary changes. If you had a cough, aching joints, or digestive troubles, your doctor might prescribe not a pill, but a visit to the tepidarium, or a change in your bathing routine. Exercise was part of the picture too. Many baths had attached palestra, open courtyards for physical activity. Romans boxed, wrestled, fenced, or played ball games before beginning the bathing process. The idea was to work up a sweat before entering the steam rooms. Health wasn't passive. It was earned, one push-up and plunge at a time. Even mental health wasn't ignored. The rhythm of the bath, its slow, deliberate transitions from room to room, encouraged reflection. Some Stoics and Epicureans even wrote about the baths as places to clear the mind and tame the emotions. In many ways, Roman baths were ahead of their time, an integrated space for exercise, cleansing, socializing, and healing. A kind of ancient wellness centre, with better mosaics and slightly more gossip. For the Romans, a healthy body wasn't a goal. It was the foundation of virtue, clarity, and strength, and the bathhouse was where it all began. Walking into a grand Roman bathhouse wasn't just stepping into a building. It was stepping into an aesthetic experience. The architecture, the materials, the very air, everything was designed to impress, soothe, and elevate. From the moment you entered the apoditerium, changing room, you were surrounded by elegance. The walls were often painted in vivid frescoes, mythological scenes, pastoral landscapes, or even cheeky caricatures. Marble benches lined the room, niches held clothing, and on the better days, musicians played softly in the background while your sandals were taken by a servant. Then came the baths themselves. The tepidarium was usually the most beautiful room, designed as a kind of warm antechamber to the hotter and colder extremes. It was often circular or rectangular, with high vaulted ceilings, colourful mosaics on the floors, and large windows that diffused the afternoon light. The ceilings were sometimes coffered or domed, supported by columns of Egyptian granite or local stone. The caldarium, the hot room, featured heated pools and steam. You'd see bronze or terracotta braziers, and sometimes gilded taps that flowed with heated water. The floors were warm beneath your feet, thanks to the hypocaust system, and the air shimmered with heat. Decorative fountains and statues added a touch of divine elegance. Apollo, Venus, and Hercules all made appearances. The frigidarium, cool and serene, was usually the largest and most striking space. Its cold pool reflected a ceiling often covered in painted stars or geometric patterns. The water itself glistened, sometimes lit by small skylights or open oculi that allowed a beam of sunlight to cut through the mist. There was a quiet stillness here, a contrast to the chatter and bustle of the earlier rooms. Everything in the Roman bath was designed to inspire awe. The use of imported marble, colourful tilework, and advanced geometry wasn't just vanity, it was a statement. The baths were the empire distilled into stone, orderly, refined, and proudly extravagant. Even smaller local baths took design seriously. Mosaics often warned bathers with humorous Latin phrases like "cave canem, beware of the dog," or "balneum gratum, the bath is pleasant." These were spaces meant to charm the eye, calm the spirit, and remind you, in case you forgot, that you were living in the greatest civilization on earth. And all of that before you even got wet. While Roman baths were public spaces in theory, not all Romans experienced them equally. The bathhouse was a microcosm of Roman society, a place where lines blurred, but never fully disappeared. Let's start with class. In the grand thermae of Rome, like those of Caracalla or Trajan, emperors might bathe in the same rooms as commoners. That sounds democratic, but social distinctions still lingered. The wealthy often arrived with entourages, slaves to carry towels, oils, and even portable benches. They could afford private massages or extra services in nearby rooms. Some larger baths had exclusive sections, scholae, reserved for upper-class patrons. Even in the shared pools, there was an unspoken hierarchy. You might rub elbows with a senator, but you weren't about to chat him up. Then there was gender. Men and women did not usually bathe together. Most large bathhouses offered separate hours or separate wings. Some emperors, like Hadrian, enforced strict segregation. Others, like Commodus or Elagabalus, allowed, or even encouraged, mixed bathing, much to the horror of conservative Roman moralists. Women's access depended on time, location, and the whims of local officials. In wealthier cities, women had beautifully appointed baths of their own. In poorer regions, they often bathed early in the day, before men arrived. While some women enjoyed regular access, others, particularly those of lower status, had to navigate schedules, scrutiny, and social stigma. Slaves and freedmen made up a significant portion of bath visitors. They were allowed in and often encouraged to attend, especially if their work was labour-intensive. However, they typically entered during off-hours or in more modest facilities. That said, many slaves worked within the bathhouses as attendants, masseurs, or fire-stokers, and some were known by name for their skill and charm. And what about outsiders? Foreigners, non-citizens, and provincials were welcomed in most Roman cities, especially in the empire's heyday. In fact, the spread of Roman baths across conquered territories was one of the empire's tools of cultural integration, a way of saying, "Welcome to Rome, now take your clothes off." So yes, the Roman baths were a shared space, but just like in the forums or the Senate, your experience depended heavily on who you were. Still, for a brief moment in the mist, the hot stone and the splash of cold water, those lines could blur. And that was part of the magic. Though bathing was the central activity, Roman bathhouses were far more than places to get clean. They were entertainment hubs, part gym, part theatre, part lounge, where you could easily spend an entire afternoon, and many did. In fact, larger bath complexes resembled ancient leisure centres. After a workout in the palestra, a courtyard used for wrestling, boxing or ball games, you might take a stroll to the library, located just off the main hallway. Yes, many baths had libraries. Romans could relax with scrolls by Cicero or Virgil, blending physical rejuvenation with intellectual stimulation. A healthy body and a healthy mind. Both were on the menu. Music filled the air too. It wasn't uncommon to hear live performances from flutists, harpists or singers echoing through the domed chambers. Bathers might be serenaded while reclining near a fountain or getting an oil rub down. In fact, some bathhouses employed professional entertainers to keep the mood light and luxurious, from acrobats to comedians. There were also food stalls and snack counters, often located in or near the apoditerium. Known as popinae, these small eateries served wine, bread, olives, cheese and dried fruits. For wealthier patrons, personal slaves could bring more elaborate dishes, and the occasional exotic treat, from nearby villas. So yes, you could technically eat grapes in the steam room like a decadent emperor, though etiquette varied. Gambling was common too. Dice games, betting on athletic matches, or just casual wagers among friends added an air of mischief to the setting. These activities weren't always legal, but they were tolerated in bath culture. After all, people came here to let loose. The bathhouses also had spaces for intimate encounters. Some rooms functioned as private lounges or even brothels, depending on the time and location. Morally ambiguous? Definitely. But Roman society had a much different view of public space, privacy, and sensuality than we do today. And the steamy, dimly lit atmosphere of the Caldarium only added to the allure. One of Rome's most remarkable achievements wasn't just building an empire, it was standardizing the Roman experience across thousands of miles. And that included baths. From the misty highlands of Britannia to the deserts of North Africa, and from the forests of Gaul to the sands of Syria, the Roman bath became a unifying symbol of Roman identity. Wherever the legions marched and the engineers followed, they built roads, forts, and bathhouses. These provincial baths weren't just carbon copies. They reflected local resources and customs while still following the essential Roman layout: apoditerium, tepidarium, caldarium, frigidarium. In cold climates like Britain or Germania, the hot rooms were especially important. In warmer places like North Africa or the Levant, some bathhouses expanded the shaded colonnades and cooled pools, offering relief from the blistering sun. Cities like Timgad in Algeria, Jerash in Jordan, and Bath in England all featured impressive thermae, often with mosaics, sculptures and inscriptions celebrating imperial generosity. These weren't just public works, they were propaganda in stone. Every polished marble slab and steaming pool reminded locals, this is Rome, and Rome takes care of its people. But baths also played a critical role in cultural integration. For newly conquered peoples, the bathhouse served as a soft introduction to Roman customs. You might still speak your own language at home, but once you stripped off your clothes and stepped into the steam, you were participating in a Roman ritual, one that transcended ethnicity, origin, or local tribe. It also became a mark of urbanization. A city wasn't truly Roman until it had proper baths. They often came bundled with forums, amphitheatres and temples, creating civic centres that mirrored those of the capital. Bathing, then, wasn't just about hygiene, it was about civilization. Of course, local twists remained. In Syria, baths sometimes incorporated Eastern architectural styles and mixed-gender spaces. In Britain, Celtic traditions subtly influenced the bathing sequence, and in Egypt, older Hellenistic models blended with Roman designs to create hybrid complexes with lush courtyards and incense-filled chambers. No matter the local flavour, the Roman bath became a universal experience, one that made an empire feel cohesive. A place where even at the farthest frontier, you could close your eyes in the Caldarium and, for a moment, feel like you were in the heart of Rome. Like so much of Roman civilization, the glory of the baths didn't last forever. As the empire weakened in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, so too did the great bathhouses. What had once been daily rituals for millions slowly slipped into disrepair, abandonment, and, eventually, ruin. Several factors contributed to this decline. First, the empire's economy crumbled under the weight of inflation, military overreach, and political instability. Funding the maintenance of vast bath complexes, which required teams of workers, constant fuel for the hypocaust, and clean water from aqueducts, became unsustainable. Then came the breakdown of infrastructure. Aqueducts fell into neglect or were deliberately destroyed during invasions. Without running water, the baths lost their core purpose. The once bubbling caldariums went dry, and the marble halls echoed with silence. Religion also played a part. As Christianity became dominant, public bathing, especially mixed or nude bathing, came under increasing moral scrutiny. Church leaders saw the baths as symbols of pagan indulgence and bodily vanity. While some Christian emperors tried to preserve the public health function of the baths, others shut them down or repurposed them into churches, monasteries, or administrative buildings. And yet, the legacy of Roman baths endured. In the Islamic world, the tradition continued through hammams, bathhouses that carried forward many Roman innovations, heated rooms, steam treatments, and communal cleansing rituals. These spread across the Middle East and North Africa, preserving the essence of Roman wellness in a new religious and cultural framework. In Europe, spas and mineral baths became popular during the Renaissance and later Enlightenment, especially in places like Bath, England, and Baden-Baden, Germany. These revived bathing as a therapeutic and social activity, echoing the Roman model even as the empire itself was long gone. Today, the ruins of Roman baths still captivate visitors. The baths of Caracalla, the Stabian baths in Pompeii, and countless smaller sites across Europe and the Mediterranean remind us that Rome didn't just conquer through the sword, it conquered through comfort, engineering, and shared ritual. Roman baths may have crumbled, but their spirit lives on. In our gyms, our spas, our hot showers, and our quiet moments of self-care. In a way, every time we draw a hot bath or sit in a sauna, we're channeling a bit of the empire, steam rising, tension fading, time slowing, just as it did 2,000 years ago. In ancient Egypt, medicine didn't live in a laboratory. It lived in the temple, the home, and the world of the gods. Healing was not just a science, it was a spiritual art, and the person who treated your illness might just recite a spell while applying a poultice to your wound. That's because Egyptian medicine was deeply intertwined with religion. Illness, to them, wasn't only about injury or infection. It could also be caused by the wrath of a god, the invasion of a malevolent spirit, or a disruption in Mayat, the cosmic order that governed all things. So, doctors, known as SWNBU, weren't always working alone. They often collaborated with priests who specialized in ritual and incantation. Together, they formed a dual force of treatment, one applying remedies, the other invoking divine protection. Temples were more than places of worship, they were centers of healing. Specific temples, like those dedicated to Imhotep, the architect, physician, and later deified healer, served as proto-hospitals. People would sleep there in hopes of divine dreams that revealed the source of their ailment or the cure itself. This was called incubation, and it was a respected method of diagnosis. Medical training was rigorous. Physicians studied scrolls like the Ebers Papyrus and Edwin Smith Papyrus, which outlined hundreds of remedies, procedures, and case studies. These documents show that while the Egyptians invoked gods, they also observed symptoms, recorded outcomes, and developed surprisingly advanced techniques, from wound suturing to dental care. But make no mistake, incantations were not just decorative. Many prescriptions included spells as ingredients. A broken bone might be treated with honey and linen, plus a recitation to ward off evil spirits. Psychological conditions, now recognized as mental illness, were seen as spiritual afflictions, often requiring the intervention of a priest or magician. To us, this fusion of medicine and mysticism might seem contradictory, but to the Egyptians, it was holistic. Body, mind, and spirit were part of the same continuum. Healing one meant addressing all. In the land of the Nile, To be a healer was to walk between two worlds, with one hand mixing herbs and the other raised toward the gods. Long before stethoscopes and lab tests, ancient Egyptian physicians relied on their senses and experience. They became masters of visual diagnosis, feeling pulses, examining wounds, and interpreting subtle signs in the body to understand what was wrong, even if they believed the root cause might be spiritual. The first step in diagnosis was always observation. Physicians would examine a patient's posture, skin colour, breath, and even urine or feces to search for visible or olfactory clues. Was the swelling soft or hard? Did the discharge smell sweet or foul? These observations weren't just guesswork. They were documented, compared, and passed down through generations. The pulse held particular significance. The Egyptians called it the speech of the heart. They believed that the heart was the centre of a system of channels, similar to a network of irrigation canals, through which air, blood, and spirit flowed. If the pulse was irregular or weak, it suggested that one of these vital channels was blocked or disturbed. Although their anatomical understanding wasn't perfect, their conclusions often reflected real symptoms and led to logical treatments. Yet when no physical explanation was found, the physician would turn to spiritual causes. Was the illness a punishment from a god? A curse from an enemy? A lingering spirit refusing to leave the body? In such cases, diagnosis involved more than examination. It required consultation with a priest-magician, dream interpretation, or even astrological analysis. The alignment of stars and the behaviour of sacred animals might factor into the final verdict. In texts like the Ebers Papyrus, physicians categorized diseases based on patterns. They didn't always know why something happened, but they knew what usually followed. For instance, they could identify the stages of an infected wound or the course of a fever. These practical patterns formed the basis for treatment protocols. And interestingly, they were not always superstitious. Some medical texts explicitly separate physical ailments from spiritual ones. If a wound could be seen, smelled, and treated, no spell required. But if all else failed, it was time to invoke divine aid. To an ancient Egyptian, the world was filled with unseen forces. But through keen eyes, careful hands, and centuries of accumulated wisdom, their physicians sought to make the invisible visible. When it came to treatment, ancient Egyptian physicians had an astonishing arsenal of remedies and recipes. Their pharmacies weren't stocked with pills and injections, but with herbs, minerals, animal products, and oils, many of which they combined with surgical procedures and ritual chants. The result? A holistic approach that blended natural science with spiritual symbolism. At the heart of their medicine was the Ebers Papyrus, a 110-page scroll from around 1550 BCE. It contains over 700 prescriptions, addressing everything from stomach pain and toothaches to skin diseases and fertility issues. Each recipe was tailored, not just to the disease, but to the patient's body and social status, and often included precise instructions for mixing, timing, and application. One of their favourite ingredients? Honey. Prized for its antimicrobial properties and still used today in wound care. Honey was applied to cuts, burns, and ulcers, often mixed with other substances like crushed seeds or resin. They also used garlic, onion, juniper berries, and myrrh, not just for their aroma but for their antiseptic and anti-inflammatory effects. Their pharmacopoeia included more exotic fare as well: crocodile dung for contraceptives, lizard blood for skin treatments, hippopotamus fat, and even mummified human flesh for particularly superstitious cures. To modern eyes, this may seem grotesque, but these remedies reflected their belief that the power of the ingredient lay not only in its physical properties, but also in its spiritual essence. Minerals like natron, a naturally occurring salt, were used to dry wounds, cleanse infections, and preserve bodies. Copper, known for its antimicrobial qualities, was sometimes crushed and mixed into salves. Oils from lotus, castor beans, and black cumin were used for massage and pain relief. Doses varied depending on the affliction. A prescription might read, mix crushed sycamore fruit, honey and natron. Apply for 4 days. Recite the following spell over the mixture. In Egypt, words were medicine too. The spoken charm activated the cure. A reminder that for them, healing was as much about meaning as it was about chemistry. Far from primitive guesswork, Egyptian medicine was highly systematic, documented, and refined. While some remedies were bizarre, many were surprisingly effective, and some survive, in spirit or science, even today. Their medicine chest was drawn from the land, the body, and the gods, and they reached into all three to heal. While much of ancient Egyptian medicine focused on herbs and incantations, the Egyptians were not afraid to cut when necessary. They understood that some ailments needed more than a poultice or a prayer. They needed a steady hand and a sharp blade. The best evidence of Egyptian surgery comes from the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a 3,600-year-old medical text, unlike any other from the ancient world. It is methodical, clinical, and strikingly modern in tone. It describes 48 cases, mostly traumatic injuries, skull fractures, broken collarbones, spinal wounds, and includes step-by-step instructions on examination, treatment, and prognosis. What's fascinating is how pragmatic the document is. It even classifies cases into 3 outcomes: an ailment I will treat, an ailment I will contend with, and an ailment not to be treated. In other words, treatable, uncertain, and hopeless. This was triage, a concept we still use in emergency medicine today. Egyptian surgeons used a range of tools: bronze knives, scalpels, forceps, cautery hooks, and needles. They practiced stitching wounds, draining abscesses, setting bones with wooden splints, and even performing circumcisions. Some mummies show evidence of successful bone healing, indicating that patients survived their injuries and continued living for years. They were also pioneers in wound hygiene. Before stitching a cut, a physician might cleanse it with honey, beer, or resin, all of which have antiseptic properties. They then applied bandages soaked in oils or herbal mixtures to reduce inflammation and promote healing. Pain was eased with opium extracts or sedative herbs, though there's no evidence of general anesthesia. Surgery was likely painful, but quick and precise. One striking detail: Egyptians often left foreign bodies, like embedded arrowheads, in place if removing them posed greater risk. It shows a nuanced understanding of anatomy and risk management. They knew when not to intervene. Of course, surgery had its limits. There's no record of internal operations or major amputations. They lacked knowledge of circulation and infection the way we know it today. But within the boundaries of what was possible, Egyptian surgeons were remarkably skilled. They didn't just experiment. They observed, recorded, and passed their knowledge down. Through bandage and blade, Egypt laid the groundwork for practical hands-on medicine, and centuries later, those lessons would echo through the halls of Greek, Roman, and modern surgical practice. In ancient Egypt, women's health was not a fringe concern. It was central to medical practice. Fertility, pregnancy, childbirth, and contraception were all treated with serious attention, and women both received and sometimes practiced medical care themselves. One of the most fascinating sources on the topic is the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, dating to around 1800 BCE. It's the oldest known medical text focused entirely on women's reproductive health. The document includes diagnoses and treatments for infertility, miscarriage, vaginal discharge, and birth complications. And like other Egyptian texts, each entry follows a familiar structure: the symptom, the examination, the diagnosis, and the treatment. Sometimes purely medical, sometimes magical, often both. For pregnancy, diagnosis began with clever experimentation. One common test involved having a woman urinate on barley and emmer wheat seeds. If the barley sprouted, she was said to be carrying a boy. If the emmer grew, a girl. If neither sprouted, she was not pregnant. Believe it or not, modern tests suggest this method may have had a modest accuracy, likely due to hormone levels affecting germination. Contraceptives were another area of focus. Ancient physicians used mixtures like honey, acacia leaves, and ground dates, inserted as a kind of barrier. Some recipes included crocodile dung, which sounds alarming, but was likely used for its sticky texture and symbolic potency. These were primitive forms of spermicides and barriers aimed at preventing conception. During childbirth, midwives took the lead. They used birth bricks, platforms on which the labouring woman squatted, and offered both physical and spiritual support. Incantations were spoken to ward off the demoness Amit, who was believed to cause miscarriages or birth complications. Protective amulets, especially those depicting Taweret, the hippo goddess of childbirth, were worn to ensure a safe delivery. If labour was difficult, treatments ranged from massaging the womb with castor oil to having the mother breathe in herbal infusions or drink mixtures to stimulate the body's opening. Caesarean sections were unknown. If the birth could not be completed naturally, tragedy often followed. Still, much of Egyptian obstetrics was remarkably advanced for its time. It reflected a culture where fertility was divine, womanhood sacred, and life itself a process watched over by both healer and God. In the cradle of civilization, they respected the cradle of life, with every chant, every herb, every whispered hope. To modern minds, the blend of magic and medicine might seem contradictory, but in ancient Egypt, the two were inseparable. Healing the body meant treating the visible symptoms and the invisible forces, and sometimes the cure came as much from a spoken word as from a poultice. The Egyptians believed that illness could be caused by many things: natural imbalances, bad food, injury, but also curses, malevolent spirits, or the will of angry gods. If you broke your leg in an accident, that was one thing. But if your stomach hurt for days with no visible cause, that might be a demon, or even the restless soul of the dead, Ak, trying to torment you. In these cases, physicians turned to Heka, the sacred power of magic, which was thought to have been given to humanity by the gods themselves. Heka wasn't stage illusion, it was a legitimate divine force, just as real as water or fire. A healer might use it to activate a remedy, protect a wound from infection, or drive out an invisible entity. Spells were often included in medical texts, such as the Ebers Papyrus and the London Medical Papyrus. Some were poetic, others aggressive. One charm for treating burns reads, "O Isis, great magician, I call upon you to cool the fire in the flesh of your servant as you cooled the fire that scorched your own son, Horus." The spoken word was thought to imbue the remedy with divine power, turning herbs into miracles. Amulets were another form of protection and healing. People wore charms shaped like the eye of Horus, ankhs, or the scarab beetle, each with symbolic significance. These amulets were believed to ward off evil, prevent disease, and protect both the living and the dead. Some were even embedded in bandages or placed directly on wounds. Specific deities were also invoked depending on the ailment. Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of plagues, was feared but also prayed to for healing. Thoth, god of wisdom, was called upon to guide the hands of surgeons and scribes alike. In Egypt, medicine without magic was incomplete. The chant, the gesture, the symbol, all were part of the cure. Because for the ancient Egyptians, healing didn't just mean removing pain, it meant restoring harmony between the body, the soul, and the cosmos. In ancient Egypt, death wasn't the end of life. It was the beginning of eternity. And to reach the afterlife, the body had to be preserved with precision and care. Enter the art of mummification, a practice that blurred the lines between medicine, magic, and mortuary science. At its core, mummification was about preserving the physical vessel so the soul could return to it in the afterlife. The body was seen as essential, not just a shell, but a sacred structure that the Ka, vital spirit, and Ba, personality or soul, needed to navigate the underworld and reunite in the next world. The process began shortly after death. Embalmers, who acted as both technicians and ritual specialists, washed the body with palm wine and Nile water. Then came the most critical step, removal of the internal organs, which were quick to decay. The stomach, intestines, lungs and liver were extracted through an incision in the left side of the abdomen and placed in separate canopic jars, each guarded by one of the 4 sons of Horus. The brain, curiously, was considered unimportant and was removed through the nose using metal hooks. The heart, believed to be the seat of intelligence and emotion, was often left in place, though in later periods it too was removed and replaced with a sacred amulet. The empty body cavity was then stuffed with resins, myrrh and linen, and the entire body was covered in natron, a natural salt mixture, to dry it out. After 40 days, the body was washed again, anointed with oils, and wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen, layer upon layer, often with protective amulets placed between folds. Each step was accompanied by spells, hymns, and rituals, particularly from the Book of the Dead. These invocations protected the deceased from demons and prepared them for judgment in the afterlife. The embalmer often wore a mask of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification, to symbolize divine authority. In many ways, mummification was the Egyptians' most advanced medical procedure, a blend of anatomy, chemistry, and spiritual engineering. It wasn't about saving a life. It was about preserving it forever. To them, the perfect body was more than a sign of health. It was a passport to eternity. And in every carefully wrapped limb, they practiced medicine for the soul. While temples and tombs held the secrets of Egypt's gods, papyrus scrolls held the secrets of its doctors. Ancient Egyptian medicine was far from a series of oral traditions or tribal remedies. It was a well-documented, professionalized system. And much of what we know comes from the surviving medical texts, written with surprising structure and care. The most famous of these is the Ebers Papyrus, dating to around 1550 BCE, though it likely copied even older knowledge. Over 100 feet long, it contains more than 700 remedies for illnesses ranging from toothaches and stomach pains to mental disturbances and tumours. It includes detailed descriptions of symptoms, diagnoses, and treatments, often paired with spells or incantations. Another key text is the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a practical surgical manual written with clinical precision. Unlike other papyri filled with magic and prayers, this one reads like the notes of a war doctor. It presents case studies of traumatic injuries, mostly fractures, dislocations, and head wounds, and outlines step by step how to examine, treat, and prognosticate. It's a rare glimpse into how Egyptians could separate spiritual belief from empirical observation. The Kahun Papyrus is another treasure, focused specifically on women's health, fertility, and gynecology. It provides insight into birth control methods, pregnancy diagnosis, and even surgical procedures related to the uterus. These texts weren't hidden away. They were studied by scribes and physicians, many of whom trained at houses of life, scholarly institutions located within temples. Here, medicine was taught alongside mathematics, astronomy, and religious lore. Medical apprentices would copy texts by hand, memorize spells, and observe more experienced doctors at work. The Egyptians believed in preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations. Each scroll was a distillation of experience, observation, and divine insight, often attributed to gods like Thoth, the deity of wisdom and writing. Physicians didn't just treat bodies, they carried forward the knowledge of millennia. Interestingly, some Egyptians
reunite in the next world. The process began shortly after death. Embalmers, who acted as both technicians and ritual specialists, washed the body with palm wine and Nile water. Then came the most critical step, removal of the internal organs which were quick to decay. The stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver were extracted through an incision in the left side of the abdomen and placed in separate canopic jars, each guarded by one of the 4 sons of Horus. The brain, curiously, was considered unimportant and was removed through the nose using metal hooks. The heart, believed to be the seat of intelligence and emotion, was often left in place, though in later periods it too was removed and replaced with a sacred amulet. The empty body cavity was then stuffed with resins, myrrh, and linen, and the entire body was covered in natron, a natural salt mixture to dry it out. After 40 days, the body was washed again, anointed with oils, and wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen, layer upon layer, often with protective amulets placed between folds. Each step was accompanied by spells, hymns, and rituals, particularly from the Book of the Dead. These invocations protected the deceased from demons and prepared them for judgment in the afterlife. The embalmer often wore a mask of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification, to symbolize divine authority. In many ways, mummification was the Egyptians' most advanced medical procedure, a blend of anatomy, chemistry, and spiritual engineering. It wasn't about saving a life, it was about preserving it forever. To them, the perfect body was more than a sign of health. It was a passport to eternity. And in every carefully wrapped limb, they practiced medicine for the soul. While temples and tombs held the secrets of Egypt's gods, papyrus scrolls held the secrets of its doctors. Ancient Egyptian medicine was far from a series of oral traditions or tribal remedies. It was a well-documented, professionalized system, and much of what we know comes from the surviving medical texts, written with surprising structure and care. The most famous of these is the Aber's Papyrus, dating to around 1550 BCE, though it likely copied even older knowledge. Over 100 feet long, it contains more than 700 remedies for illnesses ranging from toothaches and stomach pains to mental disturbances and tumors. It includes detailed descriptions of symptoms, diagnosis, and treatments, often paired with spells or incantations. Another key text is the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a practical surgical manual written with clinical precision. Unlike other papy filled with magic and prayers. This one reads like the notes of a war doctor. It presents case studies of traumatic injuries, mostly fractures, dislocations, and head wounds, and outlines step by step how to examine, treat, and prognosticate. It's a rare glimpse into how Egyptians could separate spiritual belief from empirical observation. The Kahun Papyrus is another treasure focused specifically on women's health, fertility, and gynecology. It provides insight into birth control methods, pregnancy diagnosis, and even surgical procedures related to the uterus. These texts weren't hidden away. They were studied by scribes and physicians, many of whom trained at houses of life, scholarly institutions located within temples. Here, medicine was taught alongside mathematics, astronomy, and religious law. Medical apprentices would copy texts by hand, memorize spells, and observe more experienced doctors at work. The Egyptians believed in preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations. Each scroll was a distillation of experience, observation, and divine insight, often attributed to gods like the deity of wisdom and writing. Physicians didn't just treat bodies, they carried forward the knowledge of millennia. Interestingly, some Egyptian medical ideas made their way to Greece, especially through figures like Hippocrates and Galen, who studied Egyptian practices and praised their methods. Egypt's influence on classical medicine is undeniable. In an age where much of the world relied on superstition alone, Egypt gave us one of the first examples of recorded, repeatable, and structured medical science. Written in ink, bound in papyrus, and passed on with purpose. Though the sands of time buried their temples and tombs, the legacy of ancient Egyptian medicine never truly disappeared. In fact, many of their practices, beliefs, and innovations quietly shaped the course of global medical history. Their echoes still felt in today's hospitals, pharmacies, and spiritual healing traditions. First, their systematic approach to medicine was revolutionary. The Egyptians categorized symptoms, recorded treatments, and made careful observations about cause and effect. They developed early ideas about diagnosis, prognosis, and hygiene centuries before the Greeks formalized such practices.